Welcome to this special edition of the New Stack Makers on the Road. We're here at the Open Source Summit in Dublin, Ireland. Discussions from the show floor with technologists giving you their expertise and insights to help you with your everyday work.
Hi, and welcome to another On the Road edition of the New Stacks Makers podcast. We're here at Open Source Summit in Europe, in beautiful downtown Dublin, Ireland. And I'm here today with Gabriele Columbro, and is it okay if I call you Gab?
Absolutely, Heather.
Okay, great, thanks. And Gab is going to talk about the new organization that he is the first leader of. It's Linux Foundation Europe. We're also going to talk about their first project and a little bit about some of what we've learned from the Linux Foundation's first ever survey of the European open source community. So welcome, Gab.
Thank you so much for having me here.
And I understand you have another job as well as being the new general manager of the Linux Foundation Europe.
Yeah, I keep myself busy. Yes, besides my new gig, which is, as you said, general manager for Linux Foundation Europe, newly announced, I have been running FinOS, the FinTech Open Source Foundation, for now about 6 years, actually. This is a financial services focused open source collaboration initiative. We started and ran it for 4 years, and then we merged into the Linux Foundation 2 years ago in 2020, and it's been a fantastic ride since then.
Oh, great. So you have a pretty strong connection to the Linux Foundation to begin with.
Yes, absolutely. It's been, the last 2 years really showed us how the power of having vertical industries collaborating with the broader open source technology sort of landscape that the Linux Foundation represents, has a major power.
So let's start off with a little bit of, obviously the Linux Foundation began in the US. What do you see are some of the differences between the open source community over on the other side of the pond and here in Europe?
It's a really, really good question, and one that is very sort of near and dear to my heart. I grew up here in Europe. I'm Italian, as you can hear from my outrageous Italian accent.
Oh, no, not at all.
Like Jim says.
I thought you were from the U.S. Midwest.
Oh, yeah? Oh, wow. More like from Boston or
yes.
Not the Northeast.
Wicked
Exactly,
accent.
exactly. I'm still trying to learn that accent. But yeah, I grew up as a really individual contributor. One of my main sort of initial milestones was to get my Apache address, becoming an Apache committer. And so I definitely think that in Europe there is a very grassroots passion, romantic aspect of open source. And this is actually something that also our research that you cited, uncovered. As I moved to the US, clearly you can see that most of the foundations are out of the US, Apache, Linux. Most of the commercial open source endeavors are out of the US. There is definitely a much stronger commercial ecosystem in the United States. But the reality is that those two, natures of open source are not alternatives. I think, as the Log4Shell vulnerability has deeply put us sort of in the limelight, there are issues that are across the board, across Europe and the US, and you actually need as much as the individual contributors' sort of passion, as much as, enough corporate contributions, both in terms of sort of commercial aspects, sort of commercial contribution to foundations, as well as sweat equity contributions to ensure sustainability. So I guess to your question, the research has validated sort of this hypothesis that yes, there is more of a romantic nature of open source here in Europe, but that is not necessarily alternative to the commercial dynamics around it.
So it's not an either-or situation?
It's not an either-or. I think it's a false dualism.
Okay. Well, one difference between Europe and the U.S. is that a lot of the major, the FANG companies, as they call them, Facebook,
Yes.
Apple,
Yes.
Amazon, Netflix, Google.
That acronym keeps changing, by the way.
Yes, even though they're around the world, they're based in the U.S.
Yes.
Is there an advantage or disadvantage to having Linux Foundation have an outpost kind of away from that big tech giant environment?
Look, I besides the commercial nature of some of these sort of very large big tech players, having an outpost in Europe, having a dedicated entity in Europe, is more so about focusing and really accelerating some of the aspects that we just discussed of the European specific landscape. If you pair sort of the grassroots nature that we talked about with, honestly, the European Union and Europe being very much forward-thinking when it comes to open source adoption, and certainly in many cases even open source contribution, even from the public sector. There are ongoing conversations as to whether all public administrations should only not only use open source, but really contribute to open source, everything that is built by a public administration being open source. And so to me, rather than necessarily focusing on the sort of big tech versus Europe aspect, if that makes sense, it's more about understanding that Europe has different drivers. That, to your point, there is not necessarily such a big tech presence in Europe.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that Europe is not a leader in open source, is not a leader in policy making. Think about GDPR. It's certainly highly regarded as the golden standard for data privacy. California and CCPA is adopting very much a copy-paste of GDPR, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And so, look, I won't be naive. It is important to make sure that we give voice to Europe, but that we bring, big tech to the table. And I think if there's a way that this can be achieved is through open source. And if there is a party that can do that, is such a global open governance federation like the Linux Foundation.
If I'm just a developer in Europe who maybe works at a company, works at a government agency, works as a freelancer, what are going to be the benefits of having Linux Foundation over here?
So as you might have seen in my keynote yesterday, I'm really all about marrying sort of these three natures of open source: individual / romantic nature, the commercial dynamics, and really the public sector sort of collective value mandate, and really making the best use of taxpayers' money. But when I focus on the individual developer, and again, I was one, I absolutely remember the excitement of being able to the excitement and the freedom to actually be able to partake to a broader community than necessarily just my own development team and my own proprietary, right, small sort of company. Look, I think there are three primary reasons why I think Linux Foundation Europe is a great move, and why individual developers should be involved. One, it does provide a really powerful way to potentially supercharge your project. Meaning, the Linux Foundation is a global platform. Our Linux Foundation Europe tagline is collaborate locally, innovate globally. That means that by contributing a project to Linux Foundation Europe, you actually potentially set yourself for hopefully your project making it to the global scale and becoming a de facto standard. So I think any developer should consider this as a potential springboard and platform for their technology, not just to be visible in Europe, but then hopefully beyond Europe. I think the second reason is I'm very much keen to Linux Foundation Europe operate in a data-driven way. So research, of course, was a luxury that I have as we start up with this initiative. We were able to really have a wealth of information coming out of the research that we ran, but also community-driven. In fact, I want to make sure that we learn from the community first and foremost. The next 3 months are going to be very much a learning experience for me, as of course I've grown up here, but I spent the last 10 years in the Silicon Valley. And so understanding priorities, challenges, and even just dynamics of this region at regional level and at country level, I think is going to be super important. We're hosting a roundtable later today. We will be forming an advisory board. So I think I want to encourage individual contributors to have their voice heard in the very idea of bringing all the constituents together. And then sort of the third main way, despite our survey has identified that in Europe, developers participate to open source primarily for fun, more so than sort of career advancement. Once something that actually we uncovered a lot in the US in some of the other surveys that we ran, including the FINOS, State of Open Source in Financial Services. I still do think that there is a major advantage and career opportunity for individual developers to really play in the broader arena of open source and the strong visibility that the Linux Foundation and its projects have and can give to individual developers. I am very much a huge fan of making sure that individual developers are rewarded and incentivized, and of course, hopefully properly compensated.
What about organizations? The study found that, I think it's, let me make sure I have this correct, that 35% of participants said their organization doesn't offer guidance about contributing to open source.
Yes.
Although far more offer guidance on using open source.
Yes.
What role do you think the new organization can play in getting more organizations to develop guidelines for their engineers?
It's a really good question. And in order, I think, to answer, it might be useful to share a little bit of my personal experience with FINOS.
Okay.
When we started FINOS 6 years ago, bringing together, the likes of Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, so not only banks, but investment banks. So really, the closest of the closest organizations that you can probably find in the world. Having this Italian guy telling them that they should open source their intellectual property, was a bit of a, let's say, it had a lukewarm reaction at that time. So for the first few years, our goal and focus has been very much to educate this organization as to, even before the how they could contribute, meaning which policies they should put in place.
Right.
It's about the why. I'm a huge fan about starting with the business value and why you should be participating to open source and making sure that at sort of C-level, at leadership level, there is a very clear understanding of the full sort of spectrum of benefits that you can get out of open source collaboration. So why am I leading with that is because I do see a very similar pattern into how we go about addressing this discrepancy that you've talked about in Europe. Even while I do believe that we will continue investing, in the To-Do Group and the Linux Foundation initiatives in enabling OSPOs to be more and more effective and more strategic in these organizations, I think it all starts with the why. We will have to work with the organizations in Europe to continue to level up the understanding of why they would want to contribute to open source. And in my experience, that would actually, almost as a domino effect, accelerate the process of them having a contribution policy that is effective, efficient, and aligned to sort of, their goals. And ultimately, the goal here is to achieve sustainability, because I think that this discrepancy actually does indeed challenge the overall sustainability of the ecosystem. Europe
is certainly experiencing some turbulent times right now on a geopolitical nature. How might that affect, how the new organization works with the EU and countries outside the EU, and do you foresee any challenges there?
Well, look, of course, as you say, it's a very turbulent situation, but I am very hopeful in sort of two areas. One, open source has proven to be, a great bridge across, competitive organizations, competitors in similar industries, nations, international standards, even regions, both allies and maybe less so allies. We have a very strong representation in the Linux Foundation, both from, Chinese members, US members, and European members, almost like evenly distributed. So certainly I do believe that open source has the potential to bring parties together. But I don't want to be idealistic here, of course. But the second point is that generally we see open source and investment in open source to be counter-cyclical with, the trends of investment sort of in proprietary software, for example, or just the general IT spend. In other words, when there is more pressure and when there is more pressure to reduce costs or to, reduce the workforce, that's when people are forced to look more seriously about ways to actually collaborate while still maintaining throughput and efficiency. And I think open source is, the prime way to do so. So we're not oblivious, to, of course, the political dynamics, but we're also not a policy organization. Right. So I am hopeful that actually Linux Foundation Europe can help accelerate some of these conversations, and we should not be sort of overly impacted by the unfortunately turbulent situations.
And finally, I wanted to ask you about the new project, the first project that yes. Linux Foundation Europe is taking up, Open Wallet Foundation. Yes. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that's going? Yes, I'm very excited. It's I think very important initiative. As Jim said in his press release, the digital future, goes by digital identity. And so the Open Wallet Foundation is really an effort that has seen, very broad initial support from, I think, over 50 organizations to really build an engine that can provide up to the point of the last mile, let's say, the infrastructure and standardization interoperability for multiple industries to build, digital wallets that are interoperable. Of course, we're thinking to start this project in Europe because there is a major support from European sort of members as initial sort of supporters for this project. That said, this is not just limited, of course, to European companies, very much like LFEU. Any projects under LFEU is open to any organization in the world. But I find it very aligned with not only the vision of the Linux Foundation that is about, of course, not only creating successful open source projects, but defining new markets and new commercial ecosystems around these open source projects, but very much aligned also with the sort of vision of Europe of creating a digital commons based on open source, whereby they can, achieve a sort of digital independence. Mm-hmm. And, of course, there's no secret that the main holders of wallets right now are, Apple and Google. Right. And so, I think this speaks volumes to how the Linux Foundation and Linux Foundation Europe can enable the creation of open ecosystems in place of, proprietary or more sort of segregated ecosystem. We all believe in the power of open ecosystems. So I think this is a very promising initiative, and I look forward to its evolution. Great. And it's not creating standards; it's creating the sort of the plumbing, the template to build. Yes. And I think that's also a very smart move because first of all, building standards is hard. Mm-hmm. I've participated in standard bodies and they're amazing, but without the power of the code, without getting it into the hands of developers, you risk very much to kind of go back into that fragmentation or silo sort of implementation that then, has the risk of not being interoperable. So I think starting actually from real, concrete code, and also not delivering the whole solution, making sure that you have sort of a platform that then each one can take and develop into a, commercial solution. I think it's a very, very smart vision. Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Gab. You. And this has been an On the Road edition of the New Stack Makers, and thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can always subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're on all the major social media platforms. You can always find us at thenewstack.io. We hope to see you soon.